Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that classic known as Black Sabbath. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit either in a C for classic, an I for an indie, an N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, your ghost host, here for the evening on our inaugural horror season episode.
Hello, yes, I'm Bryan, and hold on, I'm getting a call here. Pronto!
Hello, Bryan. I can see you out there. Well, welcome everybody to the latest edition of Cinema to the Letter, our first episode of our second season. We're pumped here, Bryan, as we talk about horror, as this is coming out September 26th, but we'll be doing horror episodes all throughout the month, all the way to our A for Atypical coming out on Halloween. Oh. Yes. So today we'll be covering a film for our C for Classic status, as we open any series up with. And the film we're covering is Black Sabbath from 1963, which, is from sort of this, Italian horror era. And we should kind of talk about, given sort of classic status here, Mario Bava. I noticed you'd watched a couple of movies, and so I'm curious, how do you feel about sort of him and that sort of Italian giallo style, if you're at all familiar?
Yeah, previously I had, pretty much only been aware of Dario
Right.
Argento, in terms of giallo and Italian horror films. And I'd known of Mario Bava. I'd seen, some people I follow and kind of, who had watched his movies and been like, hey, this guy's pretty good. And so I took this opportunity to watch some of his movies because I hadn't seen any of them. Specifically, I picked the film Black Sunday
Right.
and Blood and Black Lace, and I picked a non-horror one called Danger Diabolic. Although I do want to say the Italian names for all these movies are very funny, because Black Sunday is called La Maschera del Demonio, which is the mask of the demon or Satan. And then Blood and Black Lace is called Sei donne per l'assassino, practicing my Italian, which is, I believe, 6 women for the assassin.
Bryan, you're just trying to impress me. I respect it. But just so you know, I can barely speak English, so it doesn't really matter as much to me. But no, I mean, I think that's the thing also, is that, look, I've made many jokes previously of my Italian lineage, and at the same time, despite being Italian and a horror fan, not as up on my Italian horror as I am with other horror subgenres. Because I've seen, a fair amount of, Argentos, I've seen a fair amount of Fulci's, I've seen a fair amount of both, now recently, Mario, but also his son, Lamberto Bava. And yeah, I just think Italian horror is really, what I have gleamed of it is fascinating, just in terms of, with all due respect to my ancestors, these movies feel like they're from a different planet in a way that's great. That's what I really love about it. It's just, it feels so alien, different from even, because in terms of, American horror around this time, even, you've got, one of our stars, Boris Karloff, having, his comeback. So you've got, the Roger Corman era. And the Roger Corman era kind of feels like this, because it's a similar kind of, low budget, kind of lewd, dealing with, more gore and sex and all this other stuff. But at the same time, there's a weird classiness that is totally unearned, admittedly, by the content many times in these movies. Like, I've seen the Fulci movies where it's like, oh, the beautiful, serene subtlety of a woman barfing out her esophagus and guts. It's not in earned classes, but it's just kind of there.
Yeah, or even in Black Sabbath, I mean, just the, like, production design of, like, some of these, not the middle section, but the sort of, the sections that bookend the... You know, it's these really fancy, really nice apartment buildings and, like, homes. You know, it feels like there's a classiness there that comes from, I think, that, you know, a lot of older horror movies, but also, yeah, they're kind of trashy. Yeah. And I mean that in the most, like, complimentary way. But I saw that you also watched some Mario Bava films. So which ones did you watch?
Yeah, so I did a bit more than you because it kind of bled into Dragon Con research. But I I have seen. Let's see. Planet of the Vampires, which is especially interesting if you watch it with the context of this probably inspired Alien quite a bit. Because I mean. I'll just say, it's a movie about a bunch of people who are on a spaceship that crash land, and some of them start dying or being taken over by another entity, and midway through the movie, they discover a giant alien skeleton. I mean, Ridley.
Yes. And I do have more on that as we kind of get more into Black Sabbath, but go on. Yes. Yeah, which other ones did you watch?
I also watched... Blood and Black Lace, like you mentioned. A Bay of Blood, which is also fascinating. That one's like near sort of the 70s era. It's basically like the proto Friday the 13th, even more so than Halloween. Because like there are certain kills that are copied shot for shot in Friday the 13th that are in A Bay of Blood.
Oh, yes. Okay.
But then also, I love this title. This is probably my favorite of the titles was Kill Baby. Ellipses. Kill. Which I believe is an American title. Which is just the punctuation on that. There's kill, comma, baby, ellipses, kill, exclamation point. we need more of that, those kind of titles.
I love them. Yeah, it's incredible. And also, I believe the Italian name is Operazione Paura, which I believe means Operation Fear, if I'm understanding that correctly.
And I also watched Danger Diabolique, which, might be talked about later in the show, put a pin in it, by somebody. Maybe. But yeah, so it's interesting, especially because, part of this is Giallo, which I would say is probably the one that, like, I'm the least familiar with sort of, like, those Italian subgenres. But basically, like, Blood and Black Lace is very much that. I don't know how familiar you are with others of that ilk.
A bit, but I watching, like, Blood and Black Lace, for example, and really watching all of these, there is kind of a thing I noticed a lot while watching these, and while I watch a lot of older horror movies, is that you see so much of the DNA of modern horror movies, or some of the classics as well. Like, I mean, Blood and Black Lace is, one, it is a movie with a killer, and he is killing mostly women, and but even where it goes to, I don't want to spoil it, but where it goes is very interesting, and I can see a lot of filmmakers taking influence from that.
But yeah, I think for me with the Giallo especially, it's like I tend to like more of the sort of either pastiches or the later ones. Like, I'm more a fan of, say, of like Deep Red or Bird with the Crystal Plumage, in terms of, like, the Argento ilk, or even just the weird ones. Like, I love Phenomena. It's such a great fucking movie. Have you seen Phenomena?
I have not seen Phenomena. No.
It's so good. It's so fucking weird. It's one of the weirdest movies that's ever existed, but it's great.
It's the one with Jennifer.
Yes, Jennifer Connelly, Donald Pleasance.
Okay.
And he has a chimp. He, like, has a chimp that is, like, there to assist him, who has a genuinely great character arc, and I'm not kidding about that. But anyway, that's for another time. Because let's get into our main feature now. Bryan, let's talk about the 1963 film Black Sabbath, and here's the trailer.
Do you believe in ghosts?
This is the night when fear and horror walk hand in hand.
This is Black Sabbath.
starring the incomparable Boris Karloff, the personable Mark Damon, and lush and lovely women, even though one is from the netherworld, a vampire, a Vurdalak, as ancient as superstition, as modern as the telephone.
I am hungry.
Is he man or vampire? An adventure into black magic that goes beyond the boundaries of the supernatural. And a man's devoted love is welcomed by a woman's deadly lust for his blood.
All right, so Black Sabbath came out August 17th, 1963. I believe that's the Italian release. And then it's like more toward October of that year. From Mario Bava. Written by him and Marcello Fondato and Alberto... I'm sorry, Alberto. Belilacqua?
Let's see. Hold on. Let me.
Yeah, you're trying to show me up, right? You know Italian, dude.
Let's see.
Apparently so.
Oh man, that is a very Alberto Bevilacqua.
Bevilacqua? I think so.
Yeah,
Bevilacqua. Anybody out there want to correct us?
What a name.
Send us feedback. But anyway, so yeah, this is the Mario Bava 1963 film. So this is, in terms of his timeline, this is after Black Sunday. I believe his follow-up to Black Sunday, which, if you don't know, is probably the one that, like, if you say, hey, what's a Mario Bava movie? You're probably going to get recommended Black Sunday. So, right? And you watched it, right? So
yes.
What are your thoughts on that movie?
I really liked Black Sunday. It's in black and white, which is the only one I watched that was in black and white. But, like, it feels so much like a much older horror film in, like, witches, the devil, that kind of thing.
Right.
But the production design and the, like, just the castles, castles with secret passageways and, like, dungeons and really, like, all of that stuff. I loved it. And I think, the villain, the sort of witch she's like a vampire, but also a witch. It's,
right. Is she a witch or a vampire? Yes, is the answer to that.
Yeah. I just thought it was really, really fascinating. And, the black and white photography looks like just so good. I mean, I love, the ones I watched in color, but the black and white just really, like, looked incredible. But yeah, what about you? Because you had you previously seen this one?
I'd seen both, Black Sabbath and Black Sunday.
Okay.
Black Sunday, it's been a while. I wanted to try and rewatch it, but just didn't have the time. But yeah, I have a similar thing. I will also say, like, specifically, the prologue sequence of that film is, like, one of the most famous horror sequences for a reason. It's genuinely, like, probably the best depiction of sort of, like, the horror of the Salem witch trials I think we've ever seen on film. I mean that very genuinely.
Yeah, it is. I mean, like, these movies are so well directed for how, like, low budget and quote unquote cheap they can seem in some ways. But yeah, I mean, like, that section is so it sort of immediately captures you. Like, it was the first one of these I watched, and it was immediately like, oh wow, this is, like, really gripping and really visually extravagant. So was that the only ones that you had seen?
Yeah, I had seen the ones I'd mentioned, and also probably my least favorite of them, The Whip and the Body, which is a curious movie. Do you have any idea about this movie?
No, I don't.
It's weird. Basically, it's the story of this. It takes place in this big Gothic castle, and there's this woman who is, like, part of this family, and she's about to be endowed the estate or whatever. And then the sexy count cousin comes back, played by Christopher Lee.
Oh,
Though, hold on. Big caveat. We should mention these Italian movies of this era. A lot of them were sort of famous for being dubbed. because of the weird production of these movies. Basically involved like they wouldn't record sound on set because I think I apologize to the Italian film scholars out there if I get some of these facts wrong, but to my knowledge, it's like a lot of the studios that were built at this time, because of the sort of cheapness, the lack of money that they had, weren't soundproofed. So they would literally just record film and have all the actors speak. Most of them mouth English, but a few of them are speaking like their native languages, whatever they were comfortable with. But then they would end up being dubbed over. And in that movie, Christopher Lee is dubbed. And it's weird.
Okay.
It's kind of like... it's like... I have it somewhat with Boris Karloff in this movie, just because that dude has such a distinctive voice as well. But with Christopher Lee, it's just even weirder. Because, like, that dude... I've heard people do good Boris Karloff impressions. It's a lot harder to do a Christopher Lee, and he's trying to kind of. The guy who's dubbing him is kind of trying, like, no, dude.
Yeah, I was. That was a thing that I was kind of unsure about, because I had watched like Black Sunday and Blood and Black Lace they were dubbed, but they were dubbed over in English, the versions I watched.
Right.
And then the version of Black Sabbath is dubbed over in Italian. So it's a very
that's
a very
another
weird
thing is
kind of...
depending on the streaming service you might have watched or whatever. I'm curious, because this is also very crucial, and we'll change the course of this discussion. What was the order of your segments? Because depending on the one you got, it's different.
Oh, well,
I watched both, by the way. I watched both as a comparison point, but...
Okay, because I will say, I got my copy from my local library.
Oh, support your local libraries, everybody.
Yes. As you can see, the spookiest thing, a $2 overdue fee.
Oh.
Yeah, but my section, the order was the telephone, the Vertilac, and the drop of water.
Great. Yeah, because that's the better version of this movie. Spoilers. Because, like, if you don't know, basically, the production sort of history of this movie and of this time is like there was a production company called American International Pictures, which was sort of famous for taking a lot of like Italian movies and dubbing them over in English to varying degrees of quality. Basically, the two founders, James H. Nicholson and Samuel Z. Arkoff, which one of the great producer names. One of those great, like Louis B. Mayer, Samuel K. Zarkoff, Richard D. Zanuck. Just these guys are just like, I need a fucking middle initial and a weird last name and a very plain first name. But yeah, so they were trying to get a lot more films after there was a 1958 version of Hercules that was their first attempt at this, and was apparently surprisingly a hit. Everyone's like, oh fuck, wow. So they ended up getting a lot more, particularly from Mario Bava and other directors like that at this time. And Bava said, in terms of what he wanted to do with Black Sabbath, was he wanted to create stories about how terror can strike mankind in different time periods, and asked the screenwriters to get him stories from books. So AIP approved that basic thematic idea, but we're very encouraging about, like, hey, pick public domain choices, because we want to pay people any money. Which I believe, I apologize, I didn't look up what I know one of these is like a Tolstoy, I think, or something, or Tchaikovsky, maybe, I don't know. Okay. I don't know these names. I know Samuel C. Arkoff.
A name worth remembering.
Yes.
I am seeing, this is not a sort, like, on the Letterboxd page, it has, like, the original writers section, and there is Anton Chekhov and Tolstoy on there, so...
Okay.
Maybe, yeah.
All right. But, in any case, so, yeah, this is an anthology film, which I think we keep having these divergent thoughts before we really talk about Black Sabbath, but this is also an anthology movie, which is a interesting kind of movie. I'm curious, how do you feel about that concept, especially for horror? Just doing, 3 stories and a wraparound of some sort, usually.
Yeah, I was really interested to see if I would click with this one as much, because, it's a very short movie, like, off the bat. It's 95 minutes.
Right.
And so having 3 stories, I wondered how much are these actually going to, rope me in and actually keep me interested in them. And I found it to be a really perfect, like, little, a way of telling these 3 little stories that, really can't be any longer than they already are, and are, especially the first one is, like, deceptively simple, where like, you know, I'm waiting for like the moment where, you know, it becomes something else. And no, it is this very simple story. And like you were saying about the sort of order of it all, like I like the idea of bookending this with two much kind of shorter, you know, simpler, quote unquote, simpler stories, and having the middle one be a bit more meaty and a bit more kind of substantive. And I loved it. I was really surprised by how much I was invested in these three little stories. But yeah, what about you?
Well, because like I'm a big fan of the horror anthology in terms of like it's not a genre that happens a lot, especially now, but it was very prevalent, particularly in like the 80s. And I watched a lot of those. And I think the curious thing about Black Sabbath is that like usually with the horror anthology, it's kind of known if you go into it like, okay, there's probably going to be one really great segment, a couple
Right.
like depending on the length of it, like one fine one like terrible one. Usually is like kind of
Right.
the deal. But this is one of the rare ones where I would say I like all of them. I think there's a hierarchy. I think there is a first, second, third place kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah.
I would say so.
I'd be curious to we can do this a bit later, but I'd be curious to hear your ranking of them in that order. But
Well, one thing we should talk about before we get into like those three stories is just Karloff acts as a host to some degree.
Yeah.
So your crypt keeper or whatnot. In the Italian version, it's literally like two very odd bookending bits. They're
Yes.
very weird and very different, but they're both great. And yeah, so I'm curious, especially like how do you have, because you haven't seen the Universal movies, so like who is
No.
Boris Karloff to you?
that, yeah, he is kind of just a like figure of that era of horror to me, and I haven't seen any of the Universal monster
Right.
movies. I miss every single year when Criterion does that Universal monsters like section. I miss it every time. But yeah, I mostly knew him, as kind of the idea of Boris Karloff, and not really him. And
You're more familiar with,
Yes,
say, Monster Mash than any of Boris Karloff's actual works.
yeah.
Just Boris Pickett's an imitation.
Yes, right. But like, I do love the beginning, the first kind of section of him like introducing the thing. The one at the end is kind of great for me, because I'm thinking the whole time like, why is he on a horse? And then it sort of pans out and gives you that sort of view of the stage, which I think is quite beautiful in a way, of just like showing like in the behind the scenes of like how this is made, and you know, showing the guys running around with the leaves and everything. I really love that. But
It's my favorite part of the movie, quite frankly. I think there's a lot of great stuff in this movie, but that, which apparently was just a thing they threw together, because it was almost like from what I understand, like Mario Bava was talking to one of the producers, and he was just like, so yeah, I'm going to end it on the end of, in this case, the drop of water segment. Like the very last sort of shot of that segment. And then the producers were like, that seems a bit like rough. I don't know. Do you want to like have something else? And they were shooting the Wunderlack at that time. That there's a specific shot in the movie that is like the shot that we see here, pretty much.
Right.
And then it dissolves, and it's like we're putting on a show. It's like it feels like the end of a fucking Muppet movie. At the end of this pretty dark horror movie that's not that playful. Like, and the opening narration is very much that too. It's just like, oh, hello, welcome. Boris Karloff. Is there a vampire sitting next to you?
Yeah, one could be next to you. And me watching the movie by myself, I'm like, ah.
I looked over like, oh, it's my dog.
Yeah. I also just love at the end, and this is like just the attitude of the movie is so great. Like at the end of him being like, now be careful on the way home.
Well, I will say, in terms of the comparison, the one point I will give the AIP version of this movie, there's more Karloff bits in between.
Oh, cool. Is it in between each section then?
Yes, it is like literally
Okay.
he introduces each section pretty much. And
okay.
and it's really great where like his introduction to Drop of Water is him in front of like a drip, in a reflection. Just like, oh, looks like, let's hear this drop of water. And then his introduction to the telephone is literally like, it's him little next to a giant telephone. And he's just like, who knows about the invention? And all of a sudden the telephone gets picked up and he's like, oh, and then he pulls up and it's him, like a big version of him talking on the phone. And then the introduction to the Wunderlack is him in front of a bunch of trees, and he's just like, oh, this one is about the Wunderlack, which is a version of a vampire. Not that I would ever know about that, which is... But I will say, the biggest point against it, they cut the fucking Wunderlack thing at the end. That great clip is not in the AIP version.
Oh, that's weird.
Which is really weird when you consider that the order that was in the American release, in the AIP version, was Drop of Water, Telephone, and then the Wunderlack. Like, you're already ending it with the Wunderlack. That's a smoother transition.
Yeah, that is weird.
Yeah.
Huh.
But I would recommend still seeing those 3 interstitial bits. Those are fun. And also dubbed in his normal voice, which is, as I mentioned earlier, this movie where it's even... Because the thing is, a lot of these people are speaking English on set.
Yeah, like I was paying attention. I was trying to like read their lips, like I was fucking Hal, and like, and I was like, wait, they're speaking English. Like you read the subtitles and you can like see them say the words, and it's a bit jarring at times, but I don't know. You kind of have to get used to it.
Right. I just think that makes it a bit harder for me to see Boris Karloff, whose voice I'm very familiar with. We didn't talk about this. The Grinch. Like, that's the reason Boris Karloff kind of continues as the 60s special. It's him.
Right,
it's all him. And, like, that's where most people, I think, know who Boris Karloff is to some degree. And, so when you look at him, and he's, especially when he's introducing himself, like, hi, I'm Boris Karloff.
Yeah. The voice coming out of him is very, like, it's like normal Italian man. And I'm like, this is Boris Karloff. Yeah. Like, I don't know. It's very funny.
But yeah, so as you mentioned, we are going to be going in the order of the Italian version in terms of the segments, because we both watched. So we're starting off with the telephone.
Il telefono.
Yes. I know it's obviously a different language, but at a certain point it just becomes like the fish head guy from SpongeBob. But anyway, so the telephone basically is about this young lady named Rosie who is at her apartment, and she starts getting these messages on the phone. In the Italian version, it sounds at least like her ex-boyfriend who had gone to prison. She put him there, and he might be out there right now. And so she calls her buddy, Mary, played by Lydia Alfonsi. And, the situation plays out from there. So, Bryan, how'd you feel about this one? Because this one often kind of gets pegged with being the worst one, I would say, popular opinion-wise. How do you feel about it?
You know, it is kind of that thing where I'm like, is the whole thing just this room and this, like, you know, in this section? And basically it is, but I sort of... I liked that, and I like sort of the simplicity of it, and I mean, it is just Scream. Like it very much reminds me of Scream, and it's just that thing of, you know, you see the DNA of these modern horror movies when you go back and watch old ones. But I liked it because also I just love the kind of vagueness of the story, where it's like you only get vague like hints as to like, her and this guy were together, he's in prison now, and now he's escaped. Like, that's kind of it. And then, like, she's calling her friend, they have a history, it's implied that it's a lot deeper than that. But I just thought it was really clever, and, you know, it doesn't overstay its welcome, which is good, because I think that any longer than this, it would have just been like, okay, when is this thing over now?
Yeah.
But yeah, I really liked it. What about you?
Well, I think that particular last point, I think, is why... Because when I watched this originally, I kind of bought into that as well, where I liked this segment, but I didn't love it. And then seeing it again this time, after watching a lot of the other Bava sort of giallo ones I hadn't seen, I think a big problem with a lot of his giallos, which I still like all the ones I saw, but the biggest problem is that, like, even at... Some of them are, like, 80 minutes long, still feels like they're kind of stretching for time.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of them. I think Blood and Black Lace is particularly guilty of that, where I think
Yes.
the opening and ending of that movie, I think, are like the first 20 and last 20, I think, are like, oh, these are pretty, this is a pretty fucking great movie. There's a lot in the middle.
Yeah.
A lot in the middle there. That's like...
It kind of meanders a bit, yeah.
So in this case, where you have, like, the telephone, which is like this, I believe, what, is this the shortest one? Because I know the Wonderlac's the longest, and I know that Drop of Water is like 24 minutes long.
Something like that. Yeah, this probably is the shortest one.
Yeah, so around probably 20 minutes or so. But I think it's compact and it gives you everything you really need to know about these characters, and also these two lead actresses, Michelle Mercier and Lydia Alfonsi, are both really fucking great. Just in the weird, both brilliant examples of like this particular era of Italian horror and how women were presented. But at the very least,
yeah.
I'll say in a lot of those movies, it's a bit more male-gazy. But this particular segment was kind of the one of the three that got chopped up the most in the AIP version, because there's a lot of sort of themes that would indicate that Mary and Rosie are lovers.
Yes.
Yeah. They're not fucking each other in this segment.
Yeah,
basically.
there's an implication there that you can kind of put the pieces together.
Right.
And yeah.
Yes. And I think they, particularly Alfonsi, is so good, I think, at particularly portraying the twists of this character. We're initially introduced to her and she's on the phone. And it's like, oh, they're gal pals just talking with each other. And then the reveal happens and you're like, oh, wait. Oh, fuck. This is
reveal.
Really messed up. And then she comes over to the apartment, and it's just like, so hey, remember when we used to fuck? Basically, that's what the entire... It's saying that without saying that. And I think it's so well done. And I think particularly, like, there's just the small bits of body language that she has, Alfonsi, which is like the way she's like laying particularly on like the desk and also the bed, and just like, oh, here's this knife to put under your pillow because you need to stay safe, girl. You need to...
Just in case.
Just in case. Right. Yes. Particularly, my favorite bit of this, honestly, is just the cut where she's just like, "Oh well, now that all that's over, why don't you get me a nightgown?" And then they cut pretty much to Rosie on the bed, looking just like an ecstasy, basically.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. It is like really interesting to watch it and sort of see those kind of, you know, the queer subtext in there. Right. It's very interesting to watch it now, and especially as you say, like, look, women in horror movies, it's a very, you know, there are many people have...
Wow, that's crazy. Are there like multiple essays, maybe particularly about chainsaws and the representation of penises that you might be referring to?
Yes. But it is just really interesting to sort of see that subtext in a film from like 1963 that is... Yeah, it's so interesting, and I do love the way that, like, Mary, just seeing her play, like, the two sides where she's, like, on the phone being like, I'm gonna fucking kill you, and then, like, as she, like,
well, with by the way, we should mention
like,
with a rag. I love that's how it changes. So like, honestly, you know, Mary, just get into, like, a voice acting. You could dub some of these Italian movies pretty well, I would argue.
It's a pretty good, the voice is really, it's really funny. I love how, like, you know, just kind of dumb it is, where it's like just a rag over the phone that makes your voice different. Like, easy, yeah.
Right. And also just that shot when Rosie's in ecstasy and it pans over to Mary writing that fucking note. I love that note where it's just like, oh, dear Rosie, I'm sorry. Guess what? I was the one that was calling you and saying I was going to fucking kill you, and I sounded like your boyfriend. And I also put like a little newspaper clipping underneath your door and all that, but we're cool, right? We're still buddies.
Yeah, she's basically like, hey, sorry, I was in a really bad mood. I wasn't handling it well. Like, I'm sorry about that. But then
the very giallo sequence happens.
Yes,
where the boyfriend suddenly comes back and is in the room, kills Mary with her own stocking, and then is about to murder Rosie, and then she gets the upper hand with the knife, and then it ends in tragedy. And that's kind of like the perfect anthology, like, twist thing. Because I love Tales from the Crypt. Like, this one and The Drop of Water, actually. Both feel very Tales from the Crypt-ish. And with the sort of ironic comeuppance and all this other stuff. But yeah, I should mention, in the AIP version, the censoring involved, basically, one, it is not Mary who is the killer in this context. They shot a couple new things to indicate, oh, this is actually a supernatural event. Like instead of a newspaper clipping, she gets a note that writes just like, I can see you, like, and then she runs into like this guy named the Colonel, who was not in this version of the movie, I don't think. And like she just like goes into the hallway and bumps into a guy who's just like, oh, well, I can't believe what's going on. It's basically just a cover that like deliver all the information Mary gave about this. And then my favorite change, I love it so much. The note, instead of like, obviously they cut around any of like the more sexual implications. Then they have, her note is literally just like, Dear Rosie, I consulted with the psychiatrist and he determined that you were very much in need of help. And keep in mind, this is happening at like, what, 3:30 in the morning? It's like, when the fuck did you, like, who did you call? Which psychiatrist works these late hours?
That is such a weird change. That's so bizarre.
Yep. It's way worse also, spoilers. It's a very bad version of the second. Like, that's the thing is, if I grew up seeing the AIP version, which I think a lot of people did, in like particularly, in the United States, it definitely just feels like this is weird and doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I would say this is the worst segment outright as like the bad one.
Sure.
That version,
right.
Yeah. But any other thoughts on the telephone before we move on to the next story?
Well, what I was just gonna say, which I find so interesting, is like this is obviously pre slasher and pre kind of violent, too showing anything too violent, and I just find it so like interesting the way that what's his name, Frank, I believe is his name, the husband who's escaped or whatever, that he kills her with like a stocking, because it's sort of that like keeping up classy appearances where it's like, well, this is a classy murder. It's with a stocking, not a knife or anything.
Or like one of those corroding fucking like wire things.
Yeah, like... yeah. Yeah, a really great section. Shall we do the next one?
Well, I do just want to shout out one thing before we continue, is that we should credit the music in the Italian version from Roberto Nicolosi, which I think is very curious because it's like not a traditional horror score. It feels a bit more just like it fits kind of like whatever the genre of the segment kind of is. Like there's a lot of sort of 60s hangout music for most of the telephone, like particularly when Mary comes over. It's just very like weird, like Herb Albert kind of like brassy shit. It's just like, okay, this is weird. And then we get more in the AIP version. It's bad stock music, like da 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 da. Yeah,
right.
Rough. But yeah, so we should move on though to the Wunderlach, our next segment, which takes place in 19th century Serbia, which I do love how also like contemporary on either end, and then 19th century Serbia. Yeah. Specific. But here we follow Vladimir, who is this guy who's like running around on a horse.
He is a count.
Well, that's true. He is a count. It's Count Vladimir. Of course, I apologize. Yes. Look, believe me, on this particular, like when we're talking about a vampire thing, gotta respect them counts. Dracula, Vladimir, Von Count, the big ones. But yeah, so this count is wandering around in 19th century Serbia, and then goes into this small little sort of hunter's house that he finds in the eerie fog, and the family is all talking about just like, where'd you get that dagger? Because he shows this dagger, and it's like, oh, this dagger I just found along the way at this horrible murder where there was just a...
Yes, he finds a headless corpse with a knife in its back, or in its chest, I believe, right?
Right, yes.
It's hard to tell because there's no head.
Right, yes, indeed. So, yes, he apparently exposits all this, and then the family says, oh, that was probably this other baron or something like that is, like, mysteriously another character in this movie, in this segment, who's just like, oh, he's this guy who is basically going to, like, get us out of house and home. So, the patriarch... the grandpa is just like, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to kill him, no sons, don't follow me. I have to do this myself. I'll go out there and I'll ride for 5 days. And if I don't come back after 5 days, then don't let me in. And stab me through the heart. So it's like, oh shit, okay, so they established this sort of Slavic version of a vampire called the Wunderlach, which is, to my knowledge, it's a Slavic folklore legend, where some Western sources define it as like a type of Russian vampire that must consume the body of its loved ones and convert its whole family, which of course is the case when the patriarch played by Boris Karloff returns and is looking very pale and has his billowy white mustache and hair, and it's just like, nah, I'm fine. Let me in. Come on.
He shows up. He looks like a ghoul, and I believe what he says is like, "Isn't anyone gonna greet me?" or something like that. And it's like, and everyone around him is like petrified, like just like, is he alive? Or it's really funny.
Right. Yes. And so he basically is just like, nah, I'm chill. Let's go in. Let's invite me in.
Yep.
And we'll just chill out here, and I'll hang out with, my grandson, and I'll make sure you kill the dog, family things. And they're like, huh, this is very odd. And as it turns out, the patriarch has become a Wunderlach and is out to destroy the family from within. And yeah, so I'm very curious, especially Bryan, for you, because with your lack of knowledge of Mr. Karloff and the dubbing situation, do you still get the majesty and the beauty of Karloff as a horror performer in this?
A little bit, actually. Yeah. I mean, he has such a presence, obviously, like just the way he looks, and like, I think he is giving a good performance. Like, it is sort of, you have to like peel the layers of it, of like, it's, him being dubbed over, it's his, later career, stuff like that. But yeah, this was the section, I will say, that I was a bit, while I was watching it, I was a bit kind of unsure if I'd like it or not.
Yeah.
Because it feels similar to a lot of older horror movies where it's like, there's a guy, he's wandering in the woods, he's like, and then he comes across like the supernatural or the evil or whatever.
It's literally the Old Dark House, which is a movie Boris Karloff was in 30 years prior.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, right. As it sort of came together, I will say it also is the one that, similar to The Telephone, like, I can see a lot of like horror filmmakers taking influence from this, because it is like you said, it's literally a family like devouring itself. It's such a fascinating, like,
A24 horror. I think you owe Boris a bit of respect. Yes.
Yeah, and but I do love that, it is like a vampire, but that sort of twist of they consume the people they love the most is such like a genius like way to do this kind of story, and to put a bit of a twist on the kind of the traditional vampire.
Well, especially because like it feels, because as a fan of the Universal monster movies, it kind of feels in step with that in terms of it's like these characters are so archetypal, and there's not like necessarily a lot of background to them, but at the same time you get a lot of sort of the earnestness, and especially like it's based on an old sort of like Slavic folklore tale. Like, that's the IP of 1963. It's just like we're not getting the 19th century Serbia folklore cinematic universe at this point necessarily, but at the same time you even have that where like I love how in the Universal monster movies like all of the extras are like dudes in lederhosen and ladies that look like they should be at beer halls. Just like that, just like, I don't know, vaguely Eastern European, I guess.
Right, yeah.
It kind of feels in step with that in a weird way.
Yeah, where like even I'm kind of like, initially I'm like, okay, when is this? Where is this? What's going on? And then I was like, it doesn't matter. It's like medieval times, and then it's Eastern Europe.
Go with it.
It's like it's the part of Eastern Europe where vampires live. Like, we all know that place.
It's Transylvania, but we're not saying it's Transylvania.
Right. Yes, exactly. But yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on this section as a whole.
I would say, I remember when I first watched this, I thought it was my favorite I thought like, oh, this is great. And then watching it again, this is a very good segment, but it is the only one that feels long. Because this one definitely is like, what, it's like, I would say a solid 33 minutes?
Around there.
It's somewhere like this.
Yeah.
And it definitely feels it. Like, I would rather they cut a few bits out and maybe put in Boris's interstitials. Because those were actually shot later. And I'm just like, why wouldn't Bava want to do that through, like, I would want to see Boris, like, somehow involved in every single one of these segments. Even if he's, like, a cameo in, like, two of them or whatever. Or even the voice. He could have been the voice of the telephone. That would be even funnier for Mary to just be, like, doing a really great Boris Karloff impression.
Just with a rag.
But yeah, I think it's because there's kind of like a pacing issue there, and also I think that archetypalness is fine for everyone that isn't Count Vladimir. I'm sorry, Vlad. I think he's definitely just like, he's your audience surrogate beanpole who will just go around and introduce you to all the different family members. And also, because all the meaty stuff is with the other people, particularly like the sequence we kind of referenced earlier, where like after Boris Karloff comes back and then he goes into the cabin and he's just talking with everybody, but it's just like, so frustrated, and he's like clearly so like aggro and just upsetting, and there's all this stuff about like, oh my god, that dog won't shut up, kill him. And just immediately puts so much tension in the room, especially when like you take that for granted in these era horror movies, like, oh, there's a dog howling at the moon, but this guy suddenly just breaks that tradition, just like, no, fuck off, kill this dog. I want you to do, and just the sound design on it in particular is so like upsetting. Which is like the yelp that we get. It doesn't sound like a stock sound that would be like, oh, whatever, just like a bark. It just sounds like, oh, this animal just died. It's really fucked up.
Yeah, it's such a like, it's a very like disturbing section where he's like, shut up, go kill that dog right now. And I'm like, oh. I think he says, go kill my dog, which kind of makes it like more upsetting.
That's
like,
worse, yeah. That's a lot worse.
Yeah. I will agree with you, though. I think that it has a lot of pacing issues, and it's like, it kind of is a bit too long. Vladimir's not the best like character at all. Played by the way, an actor called Mark Damon.
Yes, who was one of the gets, along with Karloff. Because he was apparently, like, I forgot what he's, oh yes, he had been in Roger Corman's House of Usher. He was the lead of that movie. Okay. Which is a very good movie, I would say. At some point, we'll dig into the Corman of it all. But sure. That's a really solid version of it. So he was kind of like the big get, like, right after that. We're like, oh, look at this. It's B-movie royalty over here. And he's there.
I like it when the romance, I can't even say the romance develops, because it literally is just, they have two scenes together.
No, and then they have like one scene together, dude. They just they introduce each other, and then he's just like, hey girl, I think you're pretty cute. And then she's like, yeah, all right, let's run away together. Let me abandon my family who's being bitten to death, like becoming vampires at the hands of my grandfather. Which we shouldn't even mention, like the order is so like upsetting, where it's like Boris comes back, he insists on having his grandson on his lap, which is so fucking upsetting. And we're like, where he's being genteel toward the kid, but anyway, that's like, oh, I'm going to gobble you up like I'm a fucking the witch from Hansel and Gretel. And he does, and that's really fucked up.
It is very like the child death is just, it's so like upsetting, and also is like, I was not expecting it from like this kind of horror movie that is like, not that it isn't dark, but it is kind of that style of like, 50s and 60s horror movie where it's like, you will not believe how scary this is, like kind of that thing.
Like the Last of Us on the Left, like it's only a movie. Like
that kind of thing. Yeah.
And if you watch the trailer, which you would have heard a bit of earlier, it is very much trying to sell on like a bit of the horror, but mostly just the sex appeal of it all. With particularly this woman who I believe it's Susie Anderson, who plays Zdenka, who is very striking in the movie. I think that's a big thing. She also looks very much like, when you think of like a poster of an Italian movie where there's this like incredibly gorgeous woman on the cover, it's like, oh, it's her. Okay, yeah, that's it. That's who they painted basically for that. But I think she also, I will agree with you. I think Vladimir gets more interesting only because I think Zdenka, I think, is a more interesting character, and I think her performance actually works slightly better. Particularly the bit. It's probably my favorite bit that's not Karloff in the segment is like her talking with Vladimir, and Vladimir's like, "Oh, when does the curse stop on the 5 days?" And she says, "At midnight." It's like,
Yes, yeah.
it's even in the dubbed version of this, you can still feel like the presence of that.
Yeah, and I will say, like, towards the end where she starts to get a bit more screen time and a bit more, the story revolves more around her. Yeah, it becomes more interesting, and I mean, I think that's also helped by the fact that I think the segment as a whole just kind of picks up in that last leg, but remind me of of kind of that section. It's a bit blurry for me.
I don't know, yeah, because it's one of the other, like the one brother, I think, the one that gets ordered to shoot the dog, I think is next.
Right.
Yeah, the blonde
so,
one,
yeah.
I think. And then because it's Pietro, played by Massimo Rai, Maria played by Rika Dialina. My fucking ancestors are rolling around in the pasta fazool. And then Giorgio played by Glauco Honorato. Which once again, just Mamma Mia, indeed. But yeah, they get here in like some sequential order like that. And I will say, like, that kind of gets tedious. You kind of can see the origins of like the slasher in terms of just like the picking off order and stuff like that. But it's in very quick succession. And I would think, I would say honestly, aside from the kid is so effective, and then the other ones are like, they're solid. They look like there's a bit of gore. It's a bit kind of like, you know, it's work on that level where it's basically it's a slightly over version of like the Universal monster movies, which I think is also like a big thing with this one. It's like even just the way like the villain comes in and then like desecrates all these people, and then the ultimate twist that adds to like sort of the anthology thing in particular, where he's just like, oh, everything's safe, everything's good. And then Zdenka's like, yes, let me kiss you. And she goes for the neck.
Yes.
What? Which, it's an obvious twist, but I will say the images of Karloff and the other family members kind of like haunting and doing, especially like there's a point where they all just do like the Spike Lee shot, where it's just like on them and they're like moving around in the environment as it's going. It's spooky and effective, even if it is maybe familiar.
Yeah. And I will say, like, most of I think what I like about that section is what I mentioned earlier of just that idea of like the family destroying itself, and you know and seeing how, you know, that certainly has influenced a lot of directors. I mean, we could name like just so many movies of like family and horror and kind of it's the part that I like the most about that section, and just it's, you know, Karloff looks great. He just looks so like striking and so like
he looks
menacing,
great.
like,
and also we should mention the production design looks amazing.
Oh my gosh!
Like
yes.
while we're recording, my Zoom background is just the establishing shot of the little cottage, and it's just like exactly what you think of when you think of house in the middle of the woods. I don't want to go near, like at all.
Right? Yeah.
We're not Vlad. Just like, oh, I'll go right in. Everything will be fine.
Yes. Yeah. Any final thoughts? I guess on Verdelak.
In terms of the AIP version of this movie, I will say this one being last, I think, is a big mistake. Because, like, especially when they start off with, like, the next segment, which, spoilers, might be the one that's the best and one of the best segments in a horror anthology. Having, like, that first on the telephone, then Wonderlac. Just, like, that's... Especially when Wonderlac is as long as it is.
Right.
And you don't have that... I'm going to be pissed off again. That fucking cute Boris Karloff thing at the very end. Also, weird thing they change. This is just like, I don't know why. They change it to 10 p.m. instead of midnight. In the
Weird.
English dub.
That is weird.
Most businesses are still open at 10 p.m. unless it's like a weekday. I don't know.
The witching hour, 10 p.m.
Oh, the spookiest time when you can go to Walgreens still.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we move on now to The Drop of Water, which
Yeah.
Basically, the setup of the segment is it takes place in 1910s London and follows nurse Helen Chester. I was gonna say the production design definitely says 1910s London, but not like the look of any of the people in this movie.
No,
Everyone's so Italian. Aside from Karloff, who was playing like the Serbian guy from earlier. But anyway, so yes, Helen, who is played by Jacqueline Baroque, she's called in on the telephone by this woman who is the maid for this very rich person, this very rich lady, and she's like, "Please, nurse, you have to come. She's going into shock or whatever. Something's happened." And then she arrives, and this woman has passed. So while the nurse Helen is trying to just settle affairs, she also sees, she's got a pretty little ring on there, on her finger. Mm-hmm. Looks around.
I'm not gonna be needing that anymore.
I'll just pry that from your cold, dead hands. When she, she takes that ring, and then she leaves with it, and when she returns home, she starts hearing drops of water everywhere. And then her lights go out, and then a friend pops over.
This is the best section. I'm just gonna say
easily, yes, 100%.
I was, because after the Vertilock, which I liked, I was like, okay, I'm pretty satisfied. What is this one? I don't really know much of what it's about, and I had read like the description that was on the back of like the DVD, and I was like, that sounds like a lot to handle in, like, how long is this one? It's like under 20 minutes. Well, 24. Yeah. And it is so creepy and so unsettling. I love just one of the things offhand where, you sort of put the pieces together is that the maid references that she had seances every Friday. And it's sort of like this offhand thing, like, yeah, she had them every Friday. And you're just like, oh, that's concerning for this woman probably. It's so unsettling and so creepy when it gets to like that apartment section. But even the beginning, the production design is so like beautiful, and like this kind of like rundown like big home.
It's a Citizen Kane house too, but she's also a cat lady, which is great. This might be one of the earliest examples of cat lady.
Yeah,
in cinema.
But yeah, what about you? What are your thoughts on this section?
Well, yeah, this is the one definitely when like I had heard for years about this movie, particularly given my background with like the Gruesome Magazine days where I started doing my podcasting stuff. People like shout out Bill Mulligan, which I saw over at Dragon Con. People like that, which say like, oh, the segment that really like messed me up when I saw this on cable in the 70s was the image of our ghostly rich cat lady, who, especially the shot where it's her in the bed, where we initially see her, and because like admittingly, it's an obvious mask. Like from the moment you see her as a corpse, it's like it's a mask on a dummy initially.
Yeah,
and it looks very much like that. It's kind of silly, which almost kind of throws you off to when like later on, when the lights are out and you keep hearing these drops of water and the suspense is built up. All of a sudden, she's just like laying in that bed. And then she gets up. Yeah. It's fucking creepy.
Yeah, it's just one of those moments in a horror movie that just makes you freeze and like just pay attention to like you're just eyes wide, like watching kind of like what the fuck is happening. Yeah, it's so effective.
And especially I could get why it would build up the reputation as well, because I think we didn't talk about this movie was not successful at all when it came out. This movie made for 250 million lira, ended up making 103.5 million lira, which is like very much not a success whatsoever, at least in Italy. And I don't know how big it was in theaters in the US necessarily. But at the same time, I could see why if you saw this on cable, particularly like if you were in, I don't know, you're a youngin', so I don't know if you know about the channel surfing days, Bryan.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit. You were the tail end of that, sure, yes.
Yeah.
But imagine it's just like it's, midnight, Saturday night when you're like a kid, and you're just like, oh, I want to watch something. It's like spooky at night. Oh, what's this segment about this like lady's trying to steal a ring? and that happens, I would be terrified. That would stick with me. I could see why that
Yeah.
that kind of like helps the lasting power of this movie, that particular image.
Yeah, and it's such an effective, like, just an effective moment of just like the lighting, the way that it's shot, the way that like it like her face kind of like stands out in the darkness. It's just so creepy.
And even earlier, like my favorite lighting bit in this movie is definitely the green light that's outside her door. That's just like, it's some kind of like blinking light that's just like, oh, of course it would be like maybe a street light, or she lives next to a lighthouse, I don't know, but it's just like, oh, nope, it's this giant ominous green light that, especially when the power goes out, it's like so effective. Just
Oh,
like, why does it
man.
look fucking green?
Yeah, and even just like this is a story that I think is the most kind of like that has just like the least amount of information.
It is so simple.
Given-
It's a very bare
yeah,
bones story.
Yeah, and I think again I keep repeating kind of this idea of like you see a lot of this in modern horror, but you do like I think this section in particular was like it felt very modern to watch in a movie from the 60s. It like, you know, like you could fucking show this now and it would be like terrifying to me, but it's such an interesting part of that segment as well.
And it feels at least the most sort of like primally scary as well, because it's like, it's so
Yeah.
bare bones as a story that it kind of works. Because like the telephone works because like, oh, there's like 2 twists, and that's just
Right.
enough for that segment. The Wunderlich is kind of bloated, even though it's also a fairly simple story, but they just kind of like really luxuriate.
It's got more
in it.
characters and stuff
Right.
like that
Yes.
as well. Yeah.
That's another thing, yeah, where like you have 3 main characters in the telephone and then 3 in the Drop of Water. It's just like, it's a perfect horror movie like segment for an anthology.
Yeah,
It's definitely
yeah,
one of
that's what I was
those. If
gonna
I were to
say.
do like a top 10 list, maybe we do that in the future. I don't know. Put a pin in it, but like of sort of anthology segments, even regardless of horror, it's just like, it's such perfect sort of short storytelling, all the way to the fucking ending of this is great. We're just like, oh, she gets horribly murdered after seeing. By the way, this old woman not only is in that bed, but then she turns around like, oh, she's in my rocking chair. Oh, she's behind me and she's like about to grab me. She teleports around, and then we see the image of our lead character Jacqueline Perrault, which, by the way, we should just mention, Millie Monty is the maid, and then Harriet Medina is the concierge, and there's a police inspector and a coroner. There's like a few other characters, but she's really carrying this whole segment by herself alongside this dummy that's like mostly around her. And she does a great job. She really, I believe her sort of like desperation, the way that she's like kind of reacting, and like the look of her sort of apartment early on, to like her like, oh, that ring, well, you know, this rich old lady ain't gonna need it anymore. And then getting chased around, and then her visage of her corpse staring at the concierge lady is like also
man.
very upsetting. And also, you know what, shout out to, I also love the little insert of her ring finger that's there, and it has like the little bit of like, like there's just enough indent. Then it's like, looks like this could have come from someone taking a ring off her. And that great shot of fucking Harriet Maiden just like, what? No. What? No. No, come on. It's a very, like, it's a solid, like, ending. It also feels very, like, Tales from the Crypty.
Yeah, and what you were saying earlier as well, which I think is so, like, the real genius of this is that it is such a perfect little horror movie.
Yeah.
And it is, like, yeah, the other ones have characters, and especially after the Wunderlich, which is so bloated and has, you know, you kind of want it to be over by the time it's over. This is so, like, it just kind of captures you with, like, the mood and, like, the vibe that it's giving, which is just so, like, ominous. I also just love the shot of, like, because, like you mentioned, she's in the rocking chair, but then it has a shot of her, of, like, just the rocking chair moving.
Yes.
Like, on its own. And that is just so upsetting.
And that's the simplest editing trick possible.
Right, yeah.
And it works so well.
Yeah.
We should mention the titular element of this, the drops of water. Wonderful sound design. Amazing sound design.
Yes.
Though I will say, Helen, drain your goddamn bathtub, okay? You're not using it. No one's using it. You don't want mildew to, like, build up in that place. Come on. You gotta drain that thing.
Yeah, all I could think when, like, she just kept hearing the drops of water and kept closing the tap. I'm like, how many fucking faucets do you have in this apartment? Jesus.
Oh no, my closet faucet. It's also dripping.
Yeah, and just just the simplicity of like that sound, and at first you're just kind of like, it's just water dripping, whatever, and just the more you hear it and the repetition of it over and over again, it just becomes more creepy the more that it goes on.
You know, I'll say this might be a hot take. I don't think it is, because I like these movies, but around this time, Roger Corman was doing his Edgar Allan Poe movies.
Right.
Like The Raven and House of Usher, all these things. This is probably the most Edgar Allan Poe-y I've seen a 60s era horror movie do this. Because it feels so much like it's the beating of that hideous heart, that kind of like, that specific trope when something that feels like it would be innocuous, and you just hear it over and over again, like, shut the fuck up, I can't even hear myself think. Especially when you're in an apartment and alone. I love how this captures sort of that loneliness that she feels when she like comes back. That feeling, especially where it's like, have you ever been home alone during a power outage? Like, just the roughest thing possible.
Yeah, the isolation of it, like in the apartment, is so just creepy.
Yeah. But yeah, so then we have the little Boris Karloff thing, which I want to bring up again, everything else, because to emphasize, like, we cut after this whole, like, upsetting bit to Boris Karloff on the horse, as we saw the shot earlier when he's, dragging his grandson's corpse. It's like that shot, basically. And he just is like, oh, well, it's over, kiddies. Have a good night, and make sure to watch out who follows you home. And then we pull out, and it's like, oh, they're revealing the artifice where, like, the horse is fake. And then there's guys going around with tree branches to indicate that he's moving. And the background is clearly, like, on, like, an oscilloscope kind of thing. It's a little movie magic bit. Just like, hey, everybody, it's a show. Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Especially after after the drop of water, which, like, is scary to me watching it in 2023. But I can't, like, seeing it in 1963 must have been, like, Jesus, I have to go home after this? Like, that's, terrifying. Getting the sort of bit of Karloff bringing back kind of the fun element of it, kind of that fun horror. And then, pulling back on just seeing how this is all made and sort of reminding you, like, hey, this is just a movie. But, the movie magic is real, like you said.
Yeah, and also it feels very prevalent to, like, I mentioned this show multiple times, but that kind of Tales from the Crypt, which obviously this would have been about a decade after EC Comics kind of went defunct. I don't know if you know that whole.
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's a discussion for whenever we do cover Tales from the Crypt. But TLDR, in like the 50s, EC Comics was like this like brand of horror anthology comic where, you would open up and there'd be a host of some sort, like the Crypt Keeper. That's where it comes from. It's just like, hello, kiddies, let's look at this story. And the story happens, and he's like, oh, well, kiddies, have a good night. Make sure to buy the next issue. And when you got, especially because I'm more familiar with it from, like, the TV show with John Cassier doing the Crypt Keeper puppet, which terrified me as a child as well. Just that image, like, nope, I'm not looking at whatever the fuck that thing is at, like, 6. And then, he's just like a fun goof who makes dumb puns. He'll just be like, there'll be like a political themed episode, and he's just like, I'm running for president. And he's like, got dressed up as Uncle Sam. And then the segment happens, and he's just like, well, make sure to vote for me on Skelection Day, kiddies. That kind of shit. And this feels like sort of, I don't know if it would have been able to be inspired, because I don't know if Bava was like reading those fucking comics, because he would have been,
right.
I don't know, probably like in his 20s or something. But it feels kind of like prevalent to like what I like about a great horror anthology, that kind of like button. Just like, all right, we're done. Have fun, kids.
Yeah, it's sort of that like fun house type of horror, where it's like, well, you got your thrills now. It's time to go home now.
Yeah. But yeah, so I guess any final thoughts overall on Black Sabbath before we get into our regular segment and our closing stuff?
Yeah. I really loved this movie, more than I was expecting to. It was the last Bava I saw in this little run through, and I had really liked his horror ones, and I was like, okay, this one will probably be about the same for me. But I was just very surprised by how gripping these little stories were, and even as the middle section kind of is a bit bloated and kind of goes on for a while, I still, just the way that the look of it and just the vibe of it just is so, it was kind of made me go like, yeah, it's fall. It's time to watch some spooky stuff. It's really great. And yeah, like we mentioned, the drop of water is my favorite segment. It absolutely just creeped me out way more than I was expecting to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved it, and I'm very curious to look at more Mario Bava movies, because now I'm very interested in him as a filmmaker. Yeah, but what about you?
This is my favorite Bava. Of admittingly the limited amount I've seen, because he was so prolific, and there are so many of these movies. I'm like, I don't know how I can thank God for either your local libraries or Canopy, which is the library streaming service. If you don't know out there, you get 480p quality versions of, well, I don't know, 720. They're like 720. They're like decent.
Yeah, 720.
But versions of like several movies that really aren't on streaming services. And Canopy does also Tubi. It's on Tubi, and I love Tubi. I know you have the issue with the ads, but just the content on Tubi, the amount of stuff you get. Like, and genuinely, I was looking it up recently, and there's like, oh wow, like Sounds of the Lambs, and then a Tubi original. That's like a Saw ripoff.
All you need.
Yeah. All you need. But yeah, so it seems, Black Sabbath, I would say it's one of the more horror anthologies. It's up there. I think I have shockingly, I have a Letterboxd list of anthologies, and that's pretty high up there. And I think it evokes all the stuff that Bava wants to evoke out of like his giallos, or like sort of like a fantastical thing. Like, I also see the inspiration for like Guillermo del Toro in like the Wunderlack. We didn't really mention, but you can definitely see a lot of that. And then the sort of Tales from the Crypt elements of it as well. It just, I think it's a really solid mix of segments that are all not too similar, but all done with a familiar style that really works for all of them. And we should mention, just the biggest trivia thing, that this might be apocryphal. When I was looking this up, I saw it in a couple different places, but this movie's called Black Sabbath. If you look up Black Sabbath, you're not going to pull up this movie first. And apparently the story is that Black Sabbath in 1968, at that time, was called Earth.
Another good metal band, though, I will say.
Yes. Was playing a small club in Birmingham, England, and across the street, a movie theater was showing Black Sabbath. And apparently, allegedly, the band noticed that more people were in line to see the movie than they were to see them. So they wanted to sell horror tickets and decided just to change the name to Black Sabbath, and the rest is history. Allegedly.
I
hope it's true.
It is such a great story, because we love Black Sabbath, of course, and like it's funny to hear that they got their name from this movie. That's so interesting, which has nothing to do with like this, Sabbath, like, kind of devil stuff, really. Like Bava's other movies kind of do, but this one doesn't. It's interesting.
Yes.
But yeah.
Well, Brian, let's go ahead and get into this first edition of Between the Lines for the season. So Between the Lines is a segment where Bryan and I, each episode, will recommend another film that kind of either fits with the letter of this particular episode's topic, or, is kind of related to the film to some degree. Just recommend another one. Like, if you like this, here's something similar. And Bryan, why don't you go ahead and go first? What are you recommending for Between the Lines for this week?
Okay, so I'm recommending another Mario Bava film. Not a horror movie. Of course not. Why would it be? This is only the horror series.
Hey,
that we're doing.
It's still September when this episode's coming out.
That is true.
So kind of
that is true.
You get one.
My recommendation is Mario Bava's 1968 film called Danger Diabolic.
You should mention the colon.
Yes, Danger: Diabolic, which is how to describe this movie? It is such a bizarre movie. It is a movie about this man named Diabolic, who is like a spy, but also kind of a pirate, and kind of a criminal.
He's a thief. They describe him as a thief.
He's a thief. Yeah, he's a thief. That's a great way of
a gentleman thief.
Yes. And he lives with his girlfriend, his very pretty girlfriend, and he steals money, and he's a criminal, and the movie revolves around the cops making a deal with some mobsters to capture Diabolic. It is obviously a very similar tone to Bava's horror movies. It is so much fun, and it is just the aesthetics of it, that 1960s kind of European, very modern for the time kind of aesthetics. To give people a taste of what this movie's like, there is a section where he robs money, and the police are having this meeting, and one of them asks, what he does with the money or whatever, and he says, something that his crazy mind can think of, and it cuts to him on this massive, like those old like 60s beds that are like a huge like circle. They're usually around some kind of fireplace in the middle.
Yes.
And it's covered in money.
Yes.
And he is just having sex with his girlfriend.
Yep. They're totally naked, but you can see conveniently money is covering up certain bits and parts. There's definitely sort of an Austin Powers thing with like that, or a shower scene that happens earlier in the film.
Yeah. And it's in his like cave, which is like a underground cave. Like it looks like the Bat Cave.
Yep.
And it is such a fun movie. I had just such a blast watching it. It's so ridiculous. And yeah, it feels like a James Bond ripoff in a lot of ways. But yeah, have you seen this movie?
I watched this movie earlier today, Brian.
Okay,
yes.
Nice. What are your thoughts on this movie?
Well, it's interesting because the reputation. I'll say this much. I had seen a version of this movie before in terms of the cult favorite television series, Mystery Science Theater 3000. The final episode of their original run was this movie, kind of making fun of it.
Huh.
So I had seen it there, and I'm a big fan of that show. I love that show, but that would definitely be. This would be of sort of the MST3K kind of crop. Like it has some of those aesthetics to it. There's definitely like certain bits where like that, but it's part of the charm where it's like there are certain points where cars go over ledges and it looks great, and then there's like a certain point where like a boat sinks and it's clearly like a toy boat, like plunges into the water. But at the same time, like I think that's part of the charm because especially finding out that Bava's whole thing with that was like, oh, this is one of these like bigger co-productions. I think this is the only time he ever worked with an American studio because this is Paramount, one of the big players, just back and just like, yeah, you know what? This comic's very popular, which this is based on like an Italian comic book from '62, I believe. The comic's very popular, and Mario Bava's had a track record of making really great low budget stuff. How about Paramount gives you a bit more money, and then you get to like do whatever the hell you want? And Bava was very much like, okay, I want to impress them, so I'm gonna use my techniques I usually use to save money in order to do this, because this is like it's like 200 lira, which is a bit shorter than Black Sabbath in terms of that budget.
Right.
So he was like, despite doing a big studio movie, he cut those corners, and it didn't do well at the time, and it was kind of dismissed. And I think it feels very much in line with like a movie that would come out about 40 years later, Speed Racer.
Oh yeah,
there's a lot of Speed Racer vibes
Absolutely.
in this movie. Shout out an Ennio Morricone score that's mostly unlike you can kind of hear it in places, but it's a lot of just like 60s hip happening music. There's a point where I believe our introduction to the one gangster guy is he's at a club that's like very 60s happening, just like there's go-go dancers and there's all this other shit, and then all of a sudden, oh, the police are coming, it's rain. And then he bolts.
Yes.
But there's all sorts of fun. I think this also feels very much like an influence to like an Austin Powers as much as like the James Bond movies. Like there's a bit of James Bond, and there's also a bit of even the Adam West Batman in a really fun way.
Yeah.
Where with particular like the Bat Cave in this case is just like it's a den where they get to fuck. Pretty much, it's just it's just like this big elaborate, like literally the opening is like what it's a grass patch that opens up, and they go down. There's like a big tunnel, and it looks this amazing design of like a fake cave.
It's so good.
And then it's just like, all right, we're here. Now we're gonna fuck each other in this cave. We just park the car and fuck here. That's all we do.
The main heist of the movie is literally this heist where they're watching TV. After fucking, and there's this like new diamond being shown or something.
Well, right, where it's the ambassador and his wife, which I love. Like, especially there's a lot of great British character actors in here. Like particularly Terry Thomas is his name, who's the guy who's like the financial administrator guy who comes on television with the big gap in his tooth. Amazing. And I'm sorry, everyone. It looks like our taxes have blown up. And then he has a monocle at one point.
Yeah.
So funny.
Yes, and just the fact that he's like, I'm sure you all will pay your taxes to the country. I can trust all of you. Thank you.
What is this, the Comedy Channel?
Yeah.
It's a really fun movie. I would say this is, I think, my number 2. Like my top 3 Bavas, I would say would be Black Sabbath, then Danger Diabolique, and then third one would be A Bay of Blood. The movie I mentioned earlier. But yeah, it's a very solid pick, though. It's definitely, if you're especially kind of tired of modern superhero movies, this is a good antidote. It's a good kind of like counter where it has a lot of the aesthetics of like older superhero stuff, but also people actually have sexual chemistry with each other. How weird.
Yes, and it's also very kind of, anti-establishment, anti-government kind of
without
thing,
spoiling it, a lot of things happen to the tax offices in this movie.
It's a very incredibly fun movie. That's Danger Diabolic, such a fun movie. But what is your recommendation, Thomas?
Yes, my recommendation is sort of in the tone of like another classic era horror film. In this case, it is a 1967 film directed by Terence Fisher called Frankenstein Created Woman, which this is a Hammer production, which we didn't mention really, but around the same time, Hammer is in full swing, where you got like Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, in this case, Peter Cushing, doing his 4th Frankenstein film. And if you're unaware, basically the first one is Curse of Frankenstein, and basically the premise of the Hammer Frankensteins is our main character is the doctor. And every movie, he basically creates a monster. In the first one, it's Christopher Lee. And something goes wrong, shockingly, in this Frankenstein story. Dr. Frankenstein creates a monster the first time, and he's like, okay, I can do it again, but better. Science, you gotta, like, try it multiple times. I think he says at one point, just like, you gotta keep trying it. Scientific method. And in this 4th one, he's living in this weird Eastern European village. I know, shocking, for a 60s era horror film, particularly made in Britain. He is, trying to do his work while at the same time he has a lab assistant who's this young man who wears like a vest, and he's just like, oh, I can't wait. He literally looks like fucking like Hansel. He's just like, oh, wait, but he's like 20. He's like, oh, I can't wait to leave this small town and venture out forth. So he has this woman who he's in love with who's disabled. She has some sort of like nerve pinch damage where she can't really walk. And then she has a bit of scarring on her face. And everyone makes fun of her. And she, except for him, and he's like the only one that understands her. And the big thing also is that her father is like guarding her from him. Like, oh, he's a ruffian. You can't be with him. You gotta be with a sophisticated lad. And he runs the local pub that she helps out in. And at a certain point, while the young man is trying to get wine for Dr. Frankenstein, these 3 hooligans who are very dapperly dressed come in and just like, oh, yes, I say, could you please give us some wine? And we're going to drink as much as we can, and we're going to treat everyone like shit, particularly the poor young lady who they really demoralize. And that sends our best boy on a tirade, beats the shit out of him. Like, I want to emphasize this. They get fucked up in this barroom brawl that happens 20 minutes into this Frankenstein movie. And then the boy leaves, and then the ruffians come back and have murdered the poor young lady's father. And she's like, oh, distraught, and she has to leave and go off and like make some arrangements. And then while she's gone, our vest boy gets framed for the murder. And he is hanged. Literally, like, she's coming home in the carriage, which is right by the hanging noose. Right in front of her. Like, oh, no, I'm sorry, no. He gets, it's a guillotine. He gets guillotined. He gets, like, his head cut off. As she's, like, literally, like, she sees him, like, oh, no, and she runs up and everything. And then Dr. Frankenstein's like, well, you know what we could do? Like, while this is all going on, he's in the background doing his experiments, which are all about, like, the soul. Transferring the soul into another body. And he's just like, I wonder how we could do this. Wait, he's getting decapitated. We can take his body, sew back on the head, and then transfer his soul into another body. And that body ends up being the young lady who immediately after seeing this, she runs right over to the bridge, commits suicide. Dead. And then they bring her body back, like the villagers, and are just like, Dr. Frankenstein, can you do anything about this? And he's like, yeah, I can do something with this. So our Frankenstein monster in this case is a young woman who has amnesia, and she's like, oh, I don't know who I am, but also I hear the voice of someone who sounds familiar to me, but I don't know whose name. This voice in my head who's saying, you should go kill those fucking 3 dudes. You gotta fucking kill them. You gotta do it. And it's a really fascinating movie, especially considering the Hammer, like, Frankensteins, which I saw the ones prior to this. And I really like Curse of Frankenstein. I like Revenge of Frankenstein, the second one. The third one, The Evil of Frankenstein, is rough. Bad movie. So it's like, oh, I guess this is where it kind of goes off a cliff. And then this movie happens, and it's like, oh, well, I mean, not quite off a cliff in, like, a bad way. This is fascinating. Especially how it sort of gets into, like, the interesting dynamics of, like, a woman who has this man speaking to her in her head, and kind of, like, a weird identity issue that's going on there. And like I said, the violence is brutal, particularly that barroom brawl. It's, like, deeply, deeply gory and bloody. It was interesting. I also watched, like, a Hammer documentary, and one of the guys interviewed Mr. Martin Scorsese. He was just like, oh, yeah, I love Frankenstein Created Woman. I saw that. And they're like, this is one of the great films. I'm like, yep, I get it.
Wonderful picture.
Wonderful picture. Yes. And you can see it. Like, the barroom brawl feels a lot like Goodfellas in particular, I would say. You can see a lot of the DNA. Okay. So, see, even we talked about earlier, sort of the horror DNA element of it. Even Scorsese, what's so fascinating about him is, like, you can see a lot of horror roots in his movies, even though he's only directed, like, what, one technical horror movie? Right?
Which one are you counting as the one?
I was thinking Shutter Island, or because Cape Fear is more of a thriller.
Cape Fear is more of a thriller. Bringing Out the Dead's more of a thriller.
Taxi Driver has a lot of gory elements. It's the closest. Yeah. It feels kind of like, my whole line with that movie is it's a Nosferatu who thinks he's a Dracula.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So you can see a lot of that, and a lot of that DNA is in Frankenstein Created Woman, which, like I said, that's the 4th Frankenstein movie in the Hammer series, and I think it's the best one. It's my favorite also Hammer movie that I've seen, quite frankly, as well. So I would definitely recommend that one. And I'm guessing you had no idea this movie really existed.
No, I have very little knowledge of the Hammer horror.
Right.
That's just never been a section of horror I've dived into. I have always wanted to, and I have considered many times doing a blind buy of the Blu-ray box set that has, like, just a bunch of, like, the well-known horror ones. But yeah, I mean, this is pushing me more in that direction, especially during this time of the year. I'm very interested in these now. Yeah,
I definitely, like, because this is the first time I'd seen any of these, like, particularly the sequels to Dracula and Frankenstein. I hadn't really seen as much of them. I would say the track record so far from, like, because I went with Christopher Lee Dracula through Dracula Has Risen from His Grave. I think the track record's a bit better for Frankenstein, I would say.
Oof. He's got more points on the board.
More points, yes. But anyway, so let's repeat our titles for everybody out there, in case you want to add them to your watch list for this spooky season.
Yes, mine was the not so spooky but very fun Danger Diabolic.
But danger so spooky. With the colon in particular. The colon implies so much danger.
It's true.
And then my recommendation was the 4th entry in the Hammer Frankenstein series starring Peter Cushing of Frankenstein Created Woman. which just also a shout out. Peter Cushing rules. Because I mostly know him from Star Wars, but if you watch the old Hammer horror movies, it's like, oh, it's so great. And even that Hammer documentary I mentioned came out in like 94, and it's, I believe, the last thing he's ever involved in. Because he dies, I think, a couple months after. And he does like a lot of great narration. It's called Flesh and Blood, the Hammer horror saga, I believe. And cool. It's especially just when he does cheeky jokes about just like, oh, I can't believe this would happen in Queens, England, when like Frankenstein clips are playing and shit. It's fun. But anyway, so we are heading here to the end of our first episode here of the spooky season. So we want to do some, we want to thank some people, and then we'll tell you all about our next episode. But first we got to thank, Burial Grid for our intro music. Purchase this music at burialgrid.com. Especially, I really like with our theme song. It is very horror tinged. She has a lot of great sort of Carpenter-esque music. It's on Apple Music as well. It's all over the place. I'd recommend listening to it. And then thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And then, of course, thanks to our supporters on our Patreon, patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for $1 a month, that's all you got to pay, you get some bonus stuff. Like, we would have already put out our A Haunting in Venice audio review, which is weird. This would have come out at least a couple weeks after. We haven't seen it yet, guys, but I'm sure we're going to love it. And you'll have to hear on the Patreon to confirm it, for sure.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. A lot of mustache talk, I'm sure.
So much mustache. 90% of the episodes just on the mustache.
Yes. I don't know how you could, after Death on the Nile, I don't know how you can follow up that mustache stuff. But Kenny will find a way. And then we should also mention that on the Patreon, we do at least the one monthly bonus podcast. Around this time, you will be hearing our full franchise episode, which the patrons voted on, and they ended up picking, in this case, Toy Story. So we'll be covering the 4 Toy Story movies.
Okay.
And you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I don't know. We're recording this in advance. We always have this thing where it's like,
you never know.
You never know. You can find us there, or you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd is at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at marianithomas.wordpress.com and over at film-cred.com.
And you can find me on Twitter still, hopefully, at my name, Bryan, followed by DRADE and the number 3. You can also follow me on Letterboxd as well. See what movies I'm watching. See my many I'm getting back into my list making.
Yeah,
so,
cool.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So see what lists I'm coming up with now.
And you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts out there, whatever podcatchers and such. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, you want to listen to all the other great shows that are out there, including, we should mention in our hiatus, Bryan and I were guests on the Talk Film Society podcast where we talked about both American Pie and Days of Thunder, and also Gran Turismo, based on a true story from Gamer to Racer.
Yeah. Really fun time. That was a really fun discussion to have.
Yeah, shout out to Marcelo and Siobhan. Great hosts.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Hell yes.
So you can listen to that. And who knows, you might see some familiar faces along this season if you listen to that. Maybe, Marcelo was on our show previously. And maybe Siobhan might be in an episode in the future. Maybe.
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Nudge, nudge. And you can also dig into our archives on our Podbean main feed for all the episodes from the first season, all the Double H Double Bill stuff. And if you nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, it's cool. Money can be tight for everybody, but the completely free way to help us out is to rate, review, or share the show around. Give us more visibility, especially as we go around the Serbian woods in the 19th century in the fog. This is the end of our episode here, Bryan, but we should mention our next episode, our Eye for Indie, as we mentioned on our bonus podcast that we released before this one, is Phantasm from 1979.
Yes.
And I've seen this movie before. I think this movie's pretty great. This is another one you haven't seen, much like Black Sabbath. This is a new one for you, and you have very little knowledge, I guess, except for what I've pretty much told you and what you've you've seen the tall man around, haven't you?
I've seen, the image of him and just that's all I know, basically. You have told me some stuff, vague stuff about this movie, and I don't know anything going into it, so I'm very excited to watch it next week.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to talk about that. Maybe some of the sequels as well. This is one of those weird ones that has a lengthy franchise attached to it.
Yep.
Yeah, but until that next time, everybody, watch out who is following you home while you listen to this
Yes.
as you're on a walk of some sort.
The person listening next to you could be a vampire.
Oh.